This video is sponsored by War Thunder. More on that in just a bit. Usually with these videos, I like to start off with a profound quote. A line of dialogue or a particular scene I believe best sets the tone for both the video and the character question is headed in. And I do that so it gives a good idea for the trajectory and the evolution that'll happen at some point in time that's pivotal for the character. This video is different, as Red Dead Redemption 2 itself is quite different. The opening hours of Colter and Horseshoe Overlook are as much about the gang, the interrelationships, the established hierarchy, and the failing way of life they live by just as much as it is about Arthur. As the game progresses and Arthur's complex character begins to unravel more alongside the goalpost, Dutch moves further and further away. The chapters in Arthur's mentality, which is a very big factor in the story's tonal shift, and Arthur's own character development and what happens towards the end, means that ultimately every chapter has its own theme, its own essence, its own point of significance. We aren't just playing another character on a revenge quest or doing anything in his power to live and continue the way that he has been doing for the entirety of his life. We are, in fact, witnessing the final year of someone's life. Someone who was saved at a very young age, taught how to read and write, a massive privilege and gesture of affection by the man who took him in, further molding him how to properly carry and conduct himself, to have honor and respect in being their own version of an outlaw, to never pursue someone out of revenge, and only take from those who can afford to share and only kill those that are worthy of it. All core values and tenets taught to him at a young age that he took with him to his final days. From writing and illustrating inside of his journal, teaching the newer members such as Sadie, Charles, and Lenny just how Dutch and their gang is truly different from other cold-blooded outlaws like the O'Driscolls, and even questioning the man who taught him everything he knew when he seemed truly lost. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a story of not just the dying ways of the West, but Arthur coming to terms with questioning everything he knew, what he learned, and the person he all learned it from. It's not easy to face the person you once were or all the actions you committed, especially when you weren't proud of it in the moment. And now that death is knocking at the door, you feel more unworthy of love or any kind of salvation than ever before. And depending on how you play, you can get a very different Arthur from start to finish, making that sense of unworthiness that much more profound. Now I want to end this off with a quote that I can't remember exactly where I saw it, but regardless of how you play, I think it still ultimately rings true. And it goes, Arthur is the perfect example of fighting not because of you holding hate for who's in front of you or wanting to fight them, but fighting them because of just how much love you have for those that stand behind you. I want to take this time to thank today's sponsor, War Thunder. It's the ultimate vehicle combat game available for free on PC, consoles, and now mobile. The game allows you to commandeer over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations, from 1920s biplanes and armored cars to modern fighter jets and tanks. Now the beauty of War Thunder is the details the game boasts. Lifelike graphics and immersive sound effects put you in control of the most formidable war machines ever engineered. Join a global community of over 70 million players and engage in epic PvP battles with an incredible array of content to explore. War Thunder offers an unparalleled experience for fans of military history. A key feature I absolutely love myself about War Thunder is its impressive damage X-ray view that shows precisely when your vehicle or an enemy is destroyed. You can see where the shell penetrated and the chain of events that led to the vehicle's destruction. All of this is complemented beautifully with the brand new mobile version available for iOS and Android. It features intuitive controls, amazing graphics, and the massive multiplayer experience that's synonymous with War Thunder. It's completely an uncompromised way to play. Play War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile devices. Just use the links in the pinned comment or video description to sign up. New players and those who haven't played in the last 6 months will get an awesome bonus pack on PC or consoles. Only this does not count for mobile, including several vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account access. This offer is only available for a limited time, so do not miss out and act fast using those links down below. Thank you again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video, and back to the video.
You know, nothing means more to me than this gang. The bond we share. It's the most real thing to me. I would kill for it, I would happily die for it.
The story of the Van Der Linde gang and Arthur's own position within the criminal organization begins immediately following their hasty retreat into the Grizzly Mountains. The gang has suffered what we know as its most dramatic casualty list to date following a single robbery. Jenny Kirk, a young woman who rode with the gang, known only by her name, was killed. John Marston took a bullet in the arm. Davy Callender received a bullet to the stomach, while Sean McGuire and Matt Callender's whereabouts were left unknown. Arthur Morgan, while not participating directly in the robbery, did end up losing his own personal horse in the ensuing gunfight that spilled into the city streets. This subsequent gunfight involving the Van Der Linde gang, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and local law enforcement would see so much blood stain the city streets that the state would be on lockdown for the rest of the year. A decision reinforced with the scores of Pinkerton agents roaming the state of New Austin carrying the word of the cold-blooded murder of Heidi McCourt. Miss McCourt was described as a single mother who was an innocent bystander in the robbery. Reports were conflicting at worst and a bit murky at best on the what, how, and why of her killing, but one thing was certain: Dutch Van Der Linde was the one who pulled the trigger, taking her life and initiating the subsequent shooting that'll come to be known as the Blackwater Massacre. With the law hot on their tail, the gang would scramble into a hasty retreat up into the mountains, leaving behind a trail of bodies, all of their money, much of their belongings, and any hope of a better future. Now was simply a matter of survival. The gang came together in a moment of tragedy, and now they finally reunite in the cover of darkness, where Davy Callender succumbs to his wounds.
Miss Gaskell, get that fire lit, quick. Miss Jones, bring in whatever blankets we have. Mr. Pearson, see what we've got in terms of food.
Davy's dead.
Another life claimed by the Blackwater Massacre.
Listen to me, all of you, for a moment. We lost some folks. Now, if I could throw myself in the ground in their stead, I'd do it. Gladly. We've been through worse than this before. Now, all of you, get yourselves warm. Stay strong. Stay with me.
Preaching the importance of unity now more than ever before, we get our first glimpse into the mind of the silver-tongued Dutch Van Der Linde. Not shying away from the ugly truth of losing invaluable family members, Dutch reassures the rest of his loved ones of their safety. The high-end likelihood of being followed into a storm as unforgiving as they just did, along with his and Arthur's task of finding food, promises the beginning of their better fortune so long as they stick with him. As long as they continue to follow his leadership, all will be okay. But once he and Arthur step outside, Arthur's question of what truly transpired in Blackwater is only met with an enduring, "We missed you. That's what happened." An elusive response that's dismissed in the moment. However, rest assured, Arthur's inability to ever properly acquire a straight answer from Dutch, or even receiving an appropriate explanation of what happened and why it happened by the others that were directly involved in the furry job and witnessed Dutch's killing of Heidi McCourt, would resonate in Arthur's mind much later. For the moment, Dutch and Arthur would disappear into the darkness until they bump into one of the two men Dutch had sent ahead of the gang in search for some shelter.
You up ahead. Who's there? Whoa. Micah.
Gentlemen,
Found anything?
I think so. Found a little homestead down that way.
Okay. Anyone home?
Sure. Place is blazing with light and noise. Sounded like a party.
Let's go see.
Follow me.
The other scout was John Marston, who is currently unaccounted for. Blaming the temporary absence of John on the current storm, Dutch, Arthur, and Micah figured it was best to investigate a homestead nearby. Micah had reported bustling with lights and many voices inside. Now, the homestead would be a very tragic location itself. Despite Dutch cleverly deciding to approach as a lonely, stranded man looking for help, instructing Arthur and Micah to provide overwatch for Dutch in case things went awry, it would have all been in vain as the home was taken over and occupied by members of the violent O'Driscoll gang, a gang that had been feuding with the Van Der Linde gang for years, all stemming from a personal hatred between Dutch and the O'Driscoll's leader, Colm O'Driscoll. Between the O'Driscoll's affinity for violence and the members recognizing Dutch, there would be no other option than yet another shootout. The man would be put down without hesitation, but the tragedy wasn't the killing of outlaws working for the rivals. No, that would be the massacre of the Adler couple. Jake Adler's frozen body would be discovered by Micah outside his home in a wagon. Signs of his struggle inside the home would be spotted by Arthur by way of pool of blood and broken shelves. However, Sadie Adler, Jake's wife, would not only survive the harrowing ordeal, but would even be discovered by Micah. Traumatized by the monstrosity unleashed upon her husband, Sadie would, in a state of absolute panic, defend herself with a knife. That is until Dutch was able to calm her down, place a jacket over her, and reassure her that no harm shall fall upon her once more. She's in fact safe.
Miss, now, it is going to be okay. We mean you no harm. Miss, come on. It'll be okay. We need to get out of here, and quick. Come on now. Oh.
This night would give birth to Sadie's passionate hatred for Annie O'Driscoll here on, solidified Dutch as a warm, kind, and caring soul as far as she was concerned, and finally for Dutch, that Colm and his gang are really up in the mountains after him. At least that was the reason he would later give Arthur as to why they were going to go after Colm, while both gangs were isolated from any outside interference. Or worse, the law that is definitely on their tails. With Sadie rescued, food acquired from her home before it burned down, and information on the O'Driscolls up in the mountains alongside them, Dutch, Arthur, and Micah would retire for the night, finally getting some rest and shelter from the cold. But not everyone was back safely with the gang.
I'm sorry to ask, but
It's little John. He's got himself caught into a scrape
he
again.
ain't been seen in two days.
Your John will be fine. I mean, he may be as dumb as rocks and as dull as rusted iron, but that ain't changing because he got caught in some snowstorm.
John was now missing, and it's been 2 days since the last anyone has seen or heard a thing from him. Now, under normal circumstances, this may be no cause for concern. Yet the Van Der Linde gang is not only on the run from a law enforcement force that's more aggressive and determined than ever before, there's the addition of their fierce O'Driscoll rivals being up here, and they just faced a severe storm the night before that is only just barely beginning to let up. Between the climate and the gang's overall situation, Abigail's worry of John's disappearance was fully valid. It was only thanks to Hosea Matthews, the gang's second-in-command, Dutch's right-hand man, and the voice of reason, intervening, reinforcing Abigail's fear of the worst happening to John, did Arthur and Javier finally decide to go out and look for him. Even with the pair listening to Hosea's request for a rescue mission, the feelings of Arthur towards John were exposed in that moment between him and Abigail. He referred to John as dumb as rocks and dull as rusted iron, but his fortune won't change, nor will his mentality, all because of a small snowstorm. As he and Javier first rode out, Arthur would even say, for all we know, John kept riding north and never looked back. This wouldn't be the first time. An act committed from the past hasn't been fully forgiven, and as such, unresolved feelings all tied to the situation, how it played out, and how everyone forgave John, would slowly reveal itself as the reason why Arthur speaks and acts this way towards his adopted brother. It's an issue that Arthur is slow to share with anyone, and so for now, where the objective is to locate John, Arthur's time with Javier would be fruitless in terms of acquiring more information on what exactly happened in Blackwater. Unlike Arthur, Javier was actually present on the ferry when everything went wrong. All Javier could really add to this overall mystery was Dutch killing a woman in a bad way. It's dismissed and easily overlooked as Javier points out everything went wrong, and so the blow of Dutch uncharacteristically killing an innocent woman out in cold blood wouldn't really stand out. But the name of Heidi McCourt and the details of her killing is something that'll really never be forgotten. Not only was it the catalyst of the downfall of the Van Der Linde gang, a complete shift in life for many people that lived in Blackwater following the Blackwater massacre, but even the details and the effect on the people there is much worse than we'll ever really know. John, later in the game, when he's finally able to compose himself long enough to reflect on that moment, actually witnessing Heidi die, would struggle to articulate the brutality and gory details behind it. John himself was no stranger to bullets and blood, but it had to be something heinous, so traumatic and shocking that even he couldn't or really wouldn't want to make any sense of it, as that would force him to think more about it. It's much easier to take a deep breath and focus on the here and now. Here and now is where Arthur and Javier had to be as they home in on the distant voice of John calling for help.
That's quite a scratch you got there.
Never thought I'd say this, but it's good to see you, Arthur Morgan.
Clinging to the edge of a cliff, John was taking shelter from the unforgiving cold while doing his best to avoid being fully eaten by the wolves that attacked him and his horse. His horse wasn't as lucky as he is. A survivor of a brutal attack unleashed by a pack of wolves did leave John with a cut-up arm, a busted leg hindering his ability to walk, and slashes across his face. Slashes that will not only settle into an iconic, instantly recognizable scar, but will serve as a memory of the darkest days the Van Der Linde gang was pitted up against, hiding up in the grizzlies. With John safely back with the rest of the gang, the remaining time was spent consolidating while considering their next move. Arthur would learn how to properly hunt game with a bow, avoiding damaging the pelt or meat one could properly get. And this was thanks to the help of one of the newer members of the gang, Charles Smith. The man had seriously injured his hand sometime during the gang's escape out of Blackwater, so he was unable to hunt as efficiently as he could, but he found Arthur to be just as good with the right amount of guidance. The discourse between Arthur and Charles is also incredibly insightful into not only how the gang perceives Dutch, but people that eventually fall under his leadership. Now, Charles is by no means delusional, as he does argue against Hosea about the inability to rob and kill people pleasantly, as they don't, in spite of Dutch's talk, but he does point out Dutch is quite different. He has morals, values, goals, and does appear to look out for everyone. He also treats Charles fair, something that was incredibly difficult to find for someone who was half Native American and half African American. Yes, Charles can fall in with another gang or go off doing his own thing, but he's done both of those before, and the way he sees it, he has no want, no need, no desire to leave. Arthur would express his own gratitude personally as well as on behalf of the gang for Charles's commitment. They talk of how long Arthur's been riding with Dutch. For 20 years of sticking by his side. 20 years that was all thanks to Hosea and Dutch taking in a young delinquent, teaching him how to read, write, and separate himself from savages like the O'Driscolls. Now, like many things when replaying this game, you'll pick up on small pieces of information here or there. Maybe a seemingly insignificant piece of dialogue is just overlooked. But when you go back a second or third time, there's so much more insight provided in just a few small words. Now, I've pointed out, not only here but in many other videos, Charles' determination to stick with his gang due to Dutch being so different and standing for something that matters, in addition to treating him like a human being. But this time, what really stands out is how Arthur says Charles has been with them for roughly 5 to 6 months, and the two of them have never really talked. This would be the first time that they properly had some kind of discourse. If you didn't know, you can actually dive into Arthur's journal and get a glimpse of his mentality and the state of the gang predating the Blackwater Massacre, long before we're even introduced to the gang's current predicament here within the chapter of Colter. And while Arthur does mention other members such as Jenny, Micah, and how Dutch met Micah, Arthur never mentions Charles. Granted, there isn't much of anyone he mentions, aside from Jenny, Micah, Trelawney, and the disruptive fighting between Abigail and John that seemed to get worse by the day as they were getting closer to the Blackwater job. I guess even saying his old journal got burned down in a fire as he does in the beginning of his current journal could explain the lack of Charles being mentioned, along with everyone else. Yet, even with those who are mentioned in the current one, they're either important due to the gang's current plans, them being brand new faces, or they were causing so much of a problem that Arthur can't help but actually ignore it, such as in John's case. Charles during Colter, though, is quiet, is mild-mannered, and he's a person who has no problem carrying his own weight. Hell, he'd even go out of his own way to do as much extra as he could, and that could very well be why Arthur never really paid him that much mind or had a real conversation with him. Circumstances were now much different. They needed each other now more than ever. Despite having his hand injured, having someone like Charles here with them was more invaluable than ever before, and so I would argue, had the gang not been through this, who's to say the lack of familiarity between the two of them wouldn't have carried on for quite some time longer. At the end of the day, neither one of them seemed to really like sitting around camp doing whatever, and as long as they're not causing problems for each other or the gang while making sure needs are met, it would make sense. It's just quite a contrast from where they started to where they would eventually end up, or even in a few short months, going from Horseshoe Overlook to Clements Point. But now that the pair hadn't hunted enough meat to last them, the next move was waiting for an opportune moment to escape out of the mountains. Hosea mentioned The direction they'd be headed in now is out east, instead of the promised virgin lands of the west. The change in direction would cause concern for Arthur. As he put it, they'd be heading towards all the civilization, something that's undoubtedly set with its own challenges and cause many problems in of itself. And Hosea does agree with Arthur's apprehension, but their problems, as he put it, are bigger out west. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place, but it was better taking their chances in more civilized territory than going back facing the hail of bullets the Pinkertons had waiting, and the California collar for any survivors or those valuable enough to be used as examples for the rest of any outlaws that defied the new era of law that was right around the corner. They had a direction in mind. Whenever the weather was clear, the gang would be able to finally escape. However, there was a disagreement between the gang's leadership. Dutch, whether if he truly believed Colm O'Driscoll was up here in the mountains for him, wanted to take the opportunity to finally kill his longtime rival, or at the very least steal the train robbery the O'Driscolls were planning right underneath them in a move to irritate Colm.
I know you hate him, Dutch.
He's here for us.
I doubt that.
No, you're just doubting me.
Due to any of these single reasons, or perhaps a mixture of the three, Dutch decided now was the best opportunity to take out his longtime rival, or at the very least steal the train robbery from him in a move to further irritate Colm. In an effort to encourage those under his leadership to do so, Dutch would set this up as hitting Colm before he hits them, a lesson he claims to have learned from past experiences. And in addition to all this, hitting Colm would allow the Van Der Linde gang to seize the detonators, explosives, and plans that the O'Driscolls had on the train robbery for themselves. Should the Van Der Linde gang be successful in everything, they should be able to secure the money from the train robbery that would not only be enough to set the gang up for the future, but would come at the exact moment when the weather would begin to clear. Theoretically speaking, in terms of planning for the future, it sounded like a great plan, but Arthur, thinking logically, would seemingly be the only person to question Dutch's intentions or actual reason behind attacking the O'Driscolls, as the Van Der Linde gang were in bad shape as it was. They just got enough food to feed everyone, and even though John was the only one missing up here, and he was now back with them, he was far from a state of being able to move or be of any sort of use. The weather was still bad, Charles' hand was still injured, the gang could barely care for themselves, let alone put together some type of force in good enough shape to successfully hit their rivals. Dutch would just shrug off his adopted son's concerns and reinforce the great move hitting a train would be, especially using the information and equipment Colm has put together. As he says, Colm's information is always solid. Without any further discussion between the two of them, Dutch would hand Arthur a rifle and some rope. As with many decisions made by Dutch within the game, hell, maybe even starting as early as a Blackwater ferry job, it's interesting to think that had Dutch heeded Arthur and even Hosea's concerns, who sounded as if he was thinking very similarly to Arthur in terms of taking the gang's position in account, actually considering what they needed ahead of making moves or thinking in a way that could have cost them even more lives and put them in an overall worse position than they already were. As it seemed, that was the way Dutch was thinking. Had he listened to these two people, then maybe it could have been possible for the Van Der Linde gang to just wait for the thaw, lay low, and slip out further east when the weather let up. The train ice they stole from the O'Driscolls, after all, would be the catalyst behind the business mogul Leviticus Cornwall investing so heavily into the Pinkerton Detective Agency, flooding it with damn near limitless resources with his own personal interest, driving him to physically call out Dutch the first time he has a chance to, as well as dumping more and more money and manpower to the point of the man, Leviticus Cornwall, and his damn near bottomless amounts of resources becoming a problem that ultimately has to be dealt with, at the very least specifically for Dutch, if he ever had the faintest hope of not constantly looking over his shoulder or worried that he would end up in one of the many places that Leviticus had some type of presence in. Of course, that would just be speculation. In the typical bravado he's known for, Dutch would carry out the attack on the O'Driscolls, leaving dozens of lifeless bodies behind for Colm to find as a dead giveaway of the apparent failure to defend the valuable supplies for the robbery they had planned for themselves. On their way back to camp, Arthur would capture a man by the name of Kieran Duffy, bring him back to camp where, when the time was right, Dutch and all of his enforcers would extract as much information out of him on the possible whereabouts of Colm, his hideouts, and the plans he may have for the future. Kieran would of course deliver when the time was right, but for the next few weeks, the Van Der Linde gang would focus on laying low, wait for a break in the weather, and again, against Hosea's better judgment, would ride out to hit Leviticus Cornwall's train.
Why are we doing this? Weather's breaking, we could leave. I thought we was lying low. I just don't want any more folks to die, Dutch.
We're living, Hosea, we're living. Look at me. We're living, even you. But we need money. Everything we has in Blackwater. You fancy heading back there?
No.
It would be another successful move for the Van Der Linde gang, albeit one with some massive repercussions. The initial plan was to have Bill blow the train tracks, Dutch take control of the driver and engineer, Charles handles any outriders that may appear, Lenny and Javier take the front cars, while Arthur and Micah go straight for the back car. That is where Leviticus's private car and sought-after valuables would be located. Due to the failure of the explosives going off, they would have to improvise. Arthur and Lenny would be the only ones to successfully jump onto and stay on board the train, fighting through a heavy security force desperately trying to take control of the train's engine, forcing it to a complete stop, allowing the rest of the gang to catch up, but the remaining security force guarding the train would do so as well, resulting in much more bloodshed. By the time the smoke settled, the dozens of bodies that littered the floor pictured a scene reminiscent of the aftermath from the O'Driscoll camp. Lifeless bodies telling a story of a ruthlessly efficient gang that made off with anything of value in Mr. Cornwall's private rail car. Expensive whiskeys, coins, watches, papers tied to business plans, and most importantly, bearer bonds. Sure, it'll take some time to resell them under the right conditions, however, given enough time, it will definitely pay back the gang, and then some. Arthur would be left behind to deal with the small handful of survivors as well as the train, and once he returns back to camp in Colter, Dutch and Hosea have finally decided, based off the robbery they just pulled off, in addition to favorable weather conditions, now was the time to descend down the mountains. After weeks of hiding, the gang would emerge from the freezing cold. Hopeful of a positive change in their fortune, Hosea had already planned a new spot for them to set up a new camp at, despite it being quite some time since the last time he was physically out there, but he did remember the location of Horseshoe Overlook near Valentine. As long as they keep their noses clean, they should have no problem hiding out nearby, and the town could provide them with the opportunities they need to properly get back on their feet. A small footnote here is, Hosea and Arthur would travel together in the wagon trailing behind the rest of the gang, and for the first time, it appeared Arthur and Hosea were finally given a moment to talk between themselves about Dutch, what transpired in Blackwater, and the gang's plans for the future.
And this place we're going. Wait, well, what's it called again?
Horseshoe Overlook.
It's a good place to lie low?
It'll do for now. And how low do you think Dutch is really going to lie? It's just, you know, maybe it's me who's changed, not him, but we kept telling him that ferry job didn't feel right. You and me had a real lead in Blackwater that could have worked out.
Maybe.
It just isn't like Dutch to lose his head like that.
Now ultimately, Hosea had no information outside of what Arthur had already known. As Hosea was preoccupied with the same scam Arthur was during the time Dutch and the rest of the gang decided to proceed with the ferry job. Whatever the cause for Dutch to lose his head then, right now, they do have a chance to somewhat recover. And they would, so long as all of them, especially Dutch, lays low and keeps his head together.
We got off the mountain, rode east into some pretty enough country called the Heartlands. Ain't been this far east in many a year. Dutch seems a little better. His eyes are sparkling once more, and I can see he's thinking a little clearer. I think we all feel a little happier, in spite of Blackwater and that whole mess.
With a new camp set up, warmer weather to take advantage of, and the local town of Valentine to explore, after a couple weeks, everyone, including Hosea and Arthur, felt more optimistic than before for what lay ahead. Arthur would jot down his thoughts on Dutch appearing to have a much clearer head and even a sparkle in his eye. The time for rebuilding everything that they had lost before their massive retreat into the mountains was now. And everyone had a job to do, a specific way for them to contribute, making sure they all paid their fair share and everyone was taken care of. The women would help around camp under the watchful eye of Miss Grimshaw. Mr. Pearson immediately got to work feeding everyone. Micah and Lenny were sent off as scouts before Horseshoe Overlook was even fully set up, and Leopold Strauss had been wasting no time finding anyone down on their luck or willingly ignorant enough to accept his harsh, money-lending terms, as that was his own means to keep the mouths around camp fed. Once the new camp was stable enough, the camp's enforcers would soon venture into Valentine. Initially, they were supposed to come into the town under the guise of traveling workers, Their story was, their factory up north had just closed down and that was why they were here in Valentine. Although in light of the type of attention they'd attract in the town saloon, you can only wonder just how much of that the local population had actually bought. From the outside looking in, with everyone spreading out, wasting no opportunity to secure work or extra money for the gang, Horseshoe Overlook really looked and felt as if we were witnessing how the Van Der Linde gang operated before everything that happened in Blackwater, and before the dawn of the new era of stricter laws being imposed. The feeling of this being a newer, more optimistic bunch was felt so strongly that it's never really created again at any point in the game. But here, we are still reminded through character banter and feelings towards each other that many of these members have long-standing history.
Ow! Oh, oh!
Careful not to work yourself to death there, Uncle.
I was thinking.
Yeah, does it pay well?
Oh, eventually.
So, while the rest of us are busy stealing, killing, lying, fighting to try to survive, you get to think all day.
With some pressure of the law and the need to survive through an unforgiving winter finally alleviated, they're able to return to a more relaxed and comfortable state between each other. While they, just as much as we are reminded through certain events unfolding, such as Arthur saving Reverend Swanson not once but twice from being killed.
What the hell is wrong with you? What the hell is wrong with you? Throwing me off a bridge like that?
There was a goddamn train, you crazy bastard!
Tilly Jackson being recognized and snatched by an old gang member she used to ride with, leaving them behind on particularly bad terms.
That does not look ideal.
Excuse me.
And Arthur being recognized in Valentine as someone that hung around sometime before in Blackwater, keeps the gang, at least the more cautious and prudent types, wary of what they do and how much attention they draw to themselves. That's not to say there isn't downtime or wonderful time spent. On the contrary, Arthur's ride with Hosea to go out and hunt a massive bear would be nothing if not peaceful and quite insightful into the relationship these two have, as well as Arthur's issues with John. Without approaching his brother directly, he finally admits the resentment and harsh jokes that came at John's expense weren't signs of malice or really ill will wishing upon him, rather pain and disappointment in how John felt it much easier to just cut everyone off and run.
So how are things with you and John? It about time you let it go now?
It was a year, Hosea. He ditched us for a goddamn year. Running off on that kid is one thing, but there's code. He knows that. He ain't Trelawney. Dutch and you pretty much raised him. Nobody else would have been welcomed back that easy after that long, and you know it.
John feeling so ill-prepared for fatherhood and the responsibilities that came with it, from Arthur's perspective, it was way too easy for him to just leave the gang, Abigail, and his son for a full year without a single word. As Arthur put it, they have a code. John knew that, and if it was anyone else, they wouldn't have been welcomed back as easily as John was. Despite there being truth to what Arthur said, him attempting to justify his feelings and position with John behind the code their gang values so heavily is more so to not betray his unresolved feelings of his brother just leaving him behind. Family, as the Van Der Linde gang often viewed themselves as, don't just leave. The time Arthur spends with Hosea is also incredibly valuable, albeit quite short. The brief moment of hunting a bear with Hosea would be written down fondly by the feared enforcer saying, "I love Dutch like a father, but in many ways, I love Hosea more. He's kind and fair and like a human being. Dutch is something else." Arthur was clearly very capable of seeing at this point in the game, there was quite a contrast between his two adopted fathers. While he may be extremely grateful and loyal to Dutch, there's a gentleness attached to Hosea that Arthur admires. Now, based off other entries in his journal, it makes you wonder if his specific type of admiration for Hosea stems from feelings of guilt he has about himself. Seeing a ruthlessness in Dutch that's there in himself, but in certain circumstances it may be there in Hosea, but more often than not, it's either missing or not as harsh as Dutch in himself. If you dive into Arthur's journal, he comments on doing things he's not proud of or feeling guilty out of doing something he felt was necessary for the gang's survival. A big example of this is anything tied to Strauss's money lending schemes. Arthur's the one sent out to retrieve the money from anyone who decided it was a good idea to accept money from Strauss. And Arthur very blatantly states this type of work shames him. He doesn't like it. There's no honor or glory in it. He much prefers robbing someone directly to their face rather than getting money from them this way, even though technically this is the more legal way to do it. When he shares his thoughts about beating Thomas down, it's for the money he owes the gang. So yes, canonically speaking, he does put his hands on Thomas. Arthur mentions the entire ordeal confused him. He shares Thomas's son, Archie, stared at him as if he was the devil. Maybe to him, Arthur is. The whole thing, particularly the part he plays in it, he says revolts him. A little while later, when the gang is moving from Horseshoe Overlook to Clements Point, Arthur and Charles were tasked by Dutch to go and scout for a location that'll be a good spot for them to set up a brand new camp at, during which Charles and Arthur would come across a mother and her 2 children who were hiding underneath a wagon. The mother was terrified of what her and her children had just been through, so much so, in fact, she clenched onto a shotgun, completely white-knuckled. Her husband was taken by some local bandits for ransom. Her and her children would plead for Arthur and Charles to help, but Arthur, without a moment's hesitation, would just send them on their way.
Get the hell out of
They
here!
took off Ozza.
Who did?
Men last night.
Where? Where did they take him?
Ain't no business of ours. I don't even speak their language.
You ain't as tough and dense as all that. Come on, Arthur.
Now Charles, on the other hand, stepped in, offered their assistance, and even chastised Arthur for being so cold-blooded, willing to just send a woman and her children out on their own, which is bad enough as it is, but to be incapable of speaking the language of the country, the father has been taken away, they practically have no chance to survive on their own. And yet Arthur's concern was really the camp that they're hiding in, and not so much just helping them out. We don't see it, but in his journal, Arthur would reflect on that particular situation. He would even specifically say that he admires Charles, that he's a good man, that he wishes that he was like Charles, that doing something good came to him much more naturally. It wasn't something that he would have to think about, feeling like he has to use some type of logic to justify him doing the right thing. As he says, it feels like there's always this constant battle within him between good and evil. In these isolated incidents, there's another side to Arthur that no one else really sees. We might see someone that's cold-blooded and willing to just beat the hell out of someone for money, or despite him saying he doesn't like this type of work blatantly, even agreeing with Dutch on the topic of going and collecting a debt from someone, or the side where he's so willing to just send a woman and her children out into the wilderness without a second thought. And then in the journal, seeing it from the other side of the fence, acknowledging that, yeah, maybe he is the bad guy in these situations. Perhaps Archie's right for looking at him this type of way. Maybe Charles really was right for stepping in and saving this woman and children, and Arthur was ashamed that it was something that he had to think about, that he needed someone there to reason with him for it to make sense. By itself, from what we see and what we read, it adds another layer to Arthur. But when you take a step back, you know where Arthur is headed, where he's ultimately going to end up at. His comments in terms of reflection within his journal, the things that he says and does in front of everyone, you get a bigger picture of someone that, since the very early hours of the game, appeared to have a very high sense of self-awareness. And who knows, perhaps that was always there. It's possible that it was just put on the back burner because with these goals and plans for the future, the priority was to focus on achieving the goals, reaching Tahiti, reaching the Virgin Lands of the West, getting enough money to just disappear and relaxing. That was the primary goal. And if you have to do all this other stuff that's revolting, that's shameful, that isn't particularly things you're proud or excited to do, at least you can say there's some goodness. Maybe not for myself, but all these people, all these faces that rely on me, that rely on Dutch, that rely on Hosea, John, we're working towards something. And maybe as those dreams started to fall apart more and more and the writing was on the wall, it was just something you couldn't justify anymore. He already felt shame in the moment. With nothing else to show for it, his sickness acquired from doing the very thing he possibly was repulsed by the most, there's no wonder as to why he felt so unworthy of redemption, in spirit or in a social sense. And when you take the other emotional anchor that's introduced in Horseshoe Overlook into account, a rejection of salvation and happiness makes it that much more understanding. And that emotional connection is Mary Linton.
Dear Arthur, it's me. You know it's me from the bad handwriting. I know I said when we last spoke and I was going off to get married that we would not speak again. I know I said a lot of things and I meant them, I suppose, at the time. But I'm not so proud as to not speak to people who care for me or cared for me. I've been in Valentine for a couple of months. I had some bad luck, and, well, it's a long story and not an interesting one, but I am here for now. I saw a couple of the girls, or whatever the polite term is for them, that ran with you and your associates in town, and I heard tell of a man who sounded like you. I would love to see you again.
Now discuss Mary and Arthur much more in depth. As the game progresses, we see more of her, and there even becomes a time where it looks like her and Arthur might actually be able to run off together and escape, with Arthur having the life that he was rejected so long ago by Mary deciding to not stay by his side and run off with someone else in order to make her family happy. But for now, it's at least worth mentioning her, and shedding light on the words Arthur not only says to her, but about her within the confines of his journal. He loved her, he still loves her, and has deep feelings for her. The first interaction between the two of them, he is wary as to why after so much time she's decided to reach out. Her knowing he was even around is peculiar as it is, considering the gang hasn't been here for that much time and was somewhat keeping a very low profile. Once Arthur learns her husband Barry has passed, giving Mary an opportunity to reach out, the hope of them rekindling or possibly the sourness attached to jumping at him after she's obtained this sense of freedom is all dashed by her plea for help.
My money, my life, me. I wasn't good enough.
I'm sorry. We need your help real bad. Little Jamie's joined the Chelonians, that strange religious order.
Good for him.
They're quite mad, Arthur. They'll kill him. You're the only person he'd listen to.
So, I'm too rough to marry into your family, but it's okay to ask me to help in saving your family.
I'm sorry.
The family that was so quick to call him not good enough. His time, his money, all the effort still wasn't going to cut it, but when they need his help, it's now acceptable for him to be around so long as it's on their own terms. Arthur is sensible enough to acknowledge the poor way he's been treated and the fact that it may be the right thing to just leave Mary and her family problems alone, but he becomes putty in her hands. He feels it. Jamie, her little brother she was so worried about, sees it. Hell, everyone in the Van Der Linde gang also saw it when she was around them. Arthur himself even acknowledges it.
I feel like the luckiest man alive, and I feel like a fool. That woman confuses me and plays me for a fiddle like no one else alive. I trust I will not make a god-awful fool of myself once more, but somehow I imagine I shall.
The story between Arthur and Mary is one that I felt should be highlighted in this video, as it's pretty easily sidelined by the bigger things circulating the gang. Speaking of which, let's get back to that timeline. In between Arthur's quality time with Hosea and his small rekindling with Mary Linton, the Van Der Linde gang as a whole has been making big strides in terms of unity and strengthening their earning potential. Following the fight that erupted in the saloon of Valentine involving Charles, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and the locals, Dutch would arrive with Josiah Trelawney, a member of the Van Der Linde gang that has a very special, loose type of relationship with the gang. They allow him to come and go as he please, and would extend protection out to the eccentric fellow based off the valuable information he provides, which in this case, Josiah would bring news of Sean McGuire, one of the gang's missing members from the failed Blackwater heist. Trelawney would share that Sean is currently in the custody of Ike Skelding's boys, and they were preparing to move him and transfer his custody over to the federal government when he was rescued by Arthur, Charles, and Javier with guidance provided by Trelawney. His rescue would be followed by a massive celebration by the gang upon his return. And it's a celebration with some great timing, as it's followed with Javier and Arthur robbing a homestead together, bringing in some additional cash without major attention being drawn to them. Of course, all the money Arthur was sent out to collect that Herr Strauss has been lending out to various locals all over the state boosted their cash power even more, despite Thomas Downs not actually paying.
Where's our money?
I don't have it.
Sell your place.
We already owe more than it's worth.
Then sell your wife, or your family, or something.
Kieran Duffy, the man Arthur captured up in the Grizzly Mountains after raiding the O'Driscoll camp, was inducted as a full-fledged Van Der Linde gang member after he led an assault force to kill Colm O'Driscoll at his hideout at 6 Point Cabin. Since Colm wasn't there, the raid was technically a failure, albeit coming at the cost of yet another blow to Colm O'Driscoll's manpower pool. But the reason why Kieran was granted status as a trusted member of the Van Der Linde gang was he did end up saving Arthur's life.
You all right?
Sure. Thank you.
Meanwhile, John was finally up and moving again. He was somewhat healed from his wounds he sustained in Blackwater and in the mountains by the attack from the wolves. He'd orchestrated a successful robbery on his train. Now, each and every single one of these jobs would help further illustrate the relationships held between every gang member. At times, they were fed up with each other. At times, they joked and laughed at each other. Or, during times with Micah, Arthur's frustration and anger towards someone so callous and hot-headed was on full display.
Oh, I ain't joking, cowpoke. I heard so much bluster out of your mouth these last 6 months. And now, I got an opportunity to watch you be silenced.
Well, you gotta do something.
Why?
The whole chapter of Horseshoe Overlook, Micah was a problem. It doesn't really feel like it as he's separated from everything else, but after he and Lenny were sent off as scouts by Dutch, the pair would find themselves up in the town of Strawberry. Lenny recounts Micah was drunk before he had even gotten into town. Micah ran into someone he knew, drank some more, and killed the man before Lenny knew what happened. Micah was arrested while Lenny was lucky enough to get away, albeit by the skin of his teeth. He rode non-stop all the way back to Horseshoe Overlook, where he, frantically, would inform Arthur and Dutch of what happened. Arthur, at Dutch's behest, would of course go and save Micah from the noose that was undoubtedly going to be tightened around his neck. But before he did so, he went into Valentine with Lenny, where the two of them would get drunk, trying their best to relax and separate themselves from what Lenny had just been through. The time spent here between Lenny and Arthur wouldn't only be one of the most iconic moments shared between Arthur and another character, highlighting the very close friendship the two of them would have, but it would also be the exact moment where Arthur would begin to look at Lenny very differently. On the surface, the laughing, slapping moment of vulnerability Arthur and Lenny have is funny, but there would be a newfound sense of respect for the 19-year-old Lenny from here on out. So much so, in fact, that it's easy to think that if Lenny had been just a few years older or much closer to Arthur's age, the amount of respect he would have commanded would have easily offset the balance of the factions within the Van Der Linde gang that'll later begin to form. Lenny was calm, capable, and listened. 2 out of the 3 things Micah was incapable of doing, yet despite his reluctance, once Lenny was finally calmed, Arthur would head on over to Strawberry to save the man he can't seem to understand why Dutch had so much care for. And what he did as soon as he was freed from jail only made Arthur's curiosity of why the hell Dutch wanted to keep him around just became all the more confusing. As if killing a man and being jailed during such a delicate time for the Van Der Linde gang wasn't bad enough, as Micah ascended from the depths of his jail cell, he would go on to unleash a hail of bullets for anyone in his way, needlessly killing lawmen and locals alike, to then murder 2 people inside their homes to reclaim his precious guns. It was just another bloodbath that was entirely unnecessary. The atrocity he committed this day, in addition to forcing Arthur into aiding him in doing so, would be something Arthur would never forget. It'll serve as just another reminder that Micah is no good for them. He may be capable in a firefight, maybe even useful in securing some money, as he did follow up with a successful wagon robbery after the bloodshed he unleashed in Strawberry, but his temper and intentions are self-serving and detrimental to the gang's well-being. Whether if Arthur fully acknowledged that now or purely hated how Micah carried himself in addition to the unfortunate influence he had on Dutch, the 2 reasons would over time become intertwined, if they ever were really separate issues. But for now, as Arthur returned home to Horseshoe Overlook, he would find Abigail asking for the favor of doing something with Jack. The young boy appears to be down, leaving her worried about him, and John is still distant with her and their son. Arthur would oblige, and he decided to take Jack fishing with him. Little did he know that this small retreat of relaxation and bonding with the youngest gang member would turn into a useful reality check, as none other than Agent Andrew Milton and Agent Edgar Ross, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, would make themselves known.
Arthur, isn't it? Arthur Morgan? Agent Milton? Agent Ross. Pinkerton Detective Agency, seconded to the United States government. You're a wanted man, Mr. Morgan. We want Van Der Linde. This is my offer, Mr. Morgan. Bring in Van Der Linde. You have my word you won't swing. Spare me the philosophy lesson. I've already heard it from Mac Callender.
Mac Callender?
He was pretty shot up by the time I got to him. So really, it was more of a mercy killing. Slow, but merciful.
This unwelcomed visit by the agents shed some light on what happened to the gang's last missing member, Matt Callender. Milton claimed he killed him out of mercy, and Arthur would be blessed with the same kind of mercy if he turns in Dutch Van Der Linde. Considering Milton's discourse with his partner alluding to what the Pinkertons' files on the gang members contained, it's evident based off their knowledge of Arthur Morgan, which seemed quite extensive, Arthur was not going to turn Dutch in. The proposal by Milton served more as a warning that the Pinkerton Detective Agency is in fact closing in. Dutch and the rest of his people had a few weeks head start, but that cushion was very quickly eroding away. With Dutch made aware of the Pinkertons knowing they're in the area, he would make the wise decision of continuing to lay low, do nothing and play it by ear, as the entire thing could have very well just been a scare tactic to trick the gang into making themselves known as a final last-ditch effort to procure one big lump sum of money somewhere. And it's curious how long the gang really would have been able to play it by ear and maintain a low profile had Mr. Leviticus Cornwall not tracked Dutch down in the town of Valentine just a short time later.
You keep robbing me! My name is Leviticus Cornwall. I am not a man to be messed with by the likes of you!
Since the Van Der Linde gang arrived here in Horseshoe Overlook, they've had their sights on the town of Valentine in different ways. Mary Beth gathered information on a train filled with rich tourists. This turned into the train robbery John had put together. The bank in Valentine was also an option, as Valentine is a livestock town and as such could be unusually loaded with cash, leaving that as a lucrative prospect. And then there was the idea of the specific part of the livestock aspect of Valentine. John had now set up a plan to intercept some ranchers out in the wilderness before they reached Valentine, scare them off, and take the livestock, presenting them as their own. Then he and Arthur would turn around and sell that same livestock at an auction here within Valentine. It wasn't exactly a glamorous job, or even one that was justified through instant gratification, as they would have to wait for the auction and resale of these sheep on top of 25% kickback to the auctioneers, as they were well aware that these sheep didn't come from Arthur or John. Once their business with the auctioneers was concluded, the pair would head to the local bar to meet with Dutch and Strauss. Their arrival would save Dutch from the company of Leopold Strauss, who was wearing his leader's patience thin. Grateful for the opportunity of getting some peace, Dutch would dismiss both John and Strauss so that he and Arthur can have a moment of peace together. They discuss Dutch's frustration with Strauss and share a toast, but before they can even set their glasses down, the pair are interrupted by none other than Mr. Leviticus Cornwall.
To your good health.
Thank you.
Van Der Linde! Get out here! Get out
What
here
the
now!
hell?
Van Der Linde! You don't know me, but you keep robbing me! My name is Leviticus Cornwall. I am not a man to be messed with by the likes of you. Get out here before I have these men killed.
Cornwall's patience has ran extraordinarily thin with the Van Der Linde gang. First, this train was hid up in the Grizzlies. Then, down here, Arthur stole an oil wagon from the local oil refinery, and now, backed into a corner by Cornwall's own armed force, the gang will demonstrate once more just how deadly they can be if threatened and offered no other options. Once Dutch and Arthur emerged from within the bar, any hope for peaceful negotiations were quickly dashed. The situation would begin with Dutch distracting the men that were holding Strauss and John hostage, showing exactly how he got the title of being silver-tongued. He would talk immaculately, albeit in quite a circle. As Dutch was sucking in all of the attention, Arthur would take the opportunity to initiate the shooting. He would begin by killing the guards holding his fellow gang members captive. During this time, Strauss would end up getting shot in the leg, prompting the other three to improvise their escape plan. It was one that worked quite effectively and only took a few seconds to put together. Dutch and John would lift Strauss into a nearby wagon, and the two of them would then push the wagon carrying Strauss down the main street of Valentine with Arthur standing point, returning fire from the mobile cover the wagon was serving as. As bodies began to rain down all over the main avenue of Valentine, there was a point where they would reach the end of the street, and when they did so, Arthur would take the injured Strauss, place him on the back of John's horse, and he will then stay back, ensuring that no one followed Dutch, John, or himself back to the camp of Horseshoe Overlook. The incredible amount of death, violence, and bodies that now decorated the landscape of Valentine would, in fact, maybe the foolish move Agent Milton hoped the gang would make, giving up their presence to anyone in the area that has been hunting them down. How it all happened, though, should have served as a sign that many of their actions in the last few months have become so big, so infamous, that laying low really meant doing as little as possible, even if these actions were completely off in separate states or far away from where the camp was actually located at. Train robberies, gang rescue missions, or anything else that may even remotely betray information to those hunting them on where they are or might have gone off to is a luxury they can't afford. The physical descriptions and MOs are all known after all. Following the Valentine massacre, the gang would immediately pack up and relocate their camp further south, where they would cleverly do something even they never saw coming: helping out the local law enforcement. Granted, it was a cunning scheme from the start, but a move brand new all the same. And we'll cover the further complexity of Arthur that blossoms in the chapters of Clemens Point and Saint Denis in the next video. Episode 2, of course, but I want to end this off by thanking War Thunder for sponsoring this video again. The links to capitalize on those exclusive rewards and bonus are down in the description and pinned comment. Finally, I want to share a conversation between Mary Beth and Arthur made during Horseshoe Overlook that both highlights Arthur's awareness of the gang's current predicament, as well as his own deep level of self-awareness that permeates throughout this entire chapter.
You okay, Arthur?
I guess.
You seem kind of worried.
Of course I'm worried.
What about?
The whole world's changing. Even I see that now. Our time is pretty much past. They don't want folk like us no more. This there rules will be damned with you. No more outlaws. No more killers. Now it's us being hunted. Oh, they ain't stopping. We went and made our choices a long time ago, so I guess we gotta pay for our sins.
Oh, Arthur. What a sad world we live in.
Well, I ain't sad, Mary Beth. I'm realistic about what's coming. But I keep killing animals needlessly. And I don't know.
Arthur. Oh, Arthur. You're the only one of these fools knows just how lost he is.
Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth?